The Anthropocene, as almost everybody knows, is a contested term, a signifier of multiplicity with many different names: the Catholicene, the Plantationocene, the Capitolocene, etc. However, what remains uncontested in all these legitimate redefinitions of the word is the extent to which the Anthropocene designates a planetary phenomenon, a moment when rigid modernist distinctions, if one believes Bruno Latour, are undone, no longer fit for purpose, reactionary even. But if the Anthropocene necessarily designates a politics, and why not? A type of subjectivity is geologic and thus planetary. This does not mean for all that one ought ever to abandon the specificities of place, the differences that make up our experiences of landscape. For to do that is to abandon history, merely to replay the Western humanist quest for oneness and sameness, to forget what Catherine Youssef calls the billion black Anthropocenes that have already been, and to continue to eradicate indigenous technologies that, as James Clifford has recently pointed out, have miraculously returned from the dead. Rather, and the Hong Kong philosopher, and please excuse my pronunciation here, Yuk Hoi, is particularly good on this in his recent book, which has inspired my thinking in many ways in this paper, Art and Cosmotechnics. Hoi says that one needs to think the local and the global together, as always being in relation, as being inseparable. To speak of relation is, of course, to reiterate a word that has been close to ecological thinking from the beginning, and one sees it everywhere in new materialist ideas about entanglement. But the word relation is not neutral, an axiom that can speak for itself. Relationality has to be carefully defined and argued for, because in an important sense, the possibility of living a good Anthropocene is as dependent on what we could call a geometry of morals, as much as it is a geology of morals, as any numbers of thinkers who have politicized and racialized Deleuze and Guattari's chapter with the same name from Emile Plateau. But what exactly do I mean by a geometry of morals? Primarily and pithily this: a way of being folded into things in a manner that refutes a return to totality through a kind of synthesis that would overcome differences. To be folded, as Gilles Deleuze realizes in his late great book on the Baroque, is to hold things together in a disjunctive unity, to establish relations not just between opposites, but within opposites. The shift in prefix from between to within is crucial, I think. It means that difference is not something to be overcome or even deferred. Rather, the fold allows one to acknowledge that the without is already and always has been within. As a geometrical shape, the fold is not a bar or even a trait of union, as they say in the French language. It is best imagined as a pleat, as a volute, as a crease, as a crumpling. Something then that rethinks the entirety of what relation might mean, that makes relationality synectic, which in Greek, as Howard Kagel explains, means the coming together of opposites, which in Karen Barad's language, one might think of as something that is cut together apart. Thought of synectically as a geometry of the one within the multiple and the multiple within the one, the Anthropocene, the good Anthropocene, is predicated on a relative universalism, one that is able to imagine the planet as a fractured mosaic, both plate tectonic and weather system, the circulation of compounds that insist on heterogeneity and homogeneity. We need new words, a different lexicon for thinking this geometry, maybe even for moralizing it. We also think, as Yuk Hoi does, a new way of thinking about art, of approaching the aesthetic, of learning how to increase our notion of acceptance of a work, how to ground it, how to make it both terrestrial and cosmic, and perhaps to do the thing that Bruno Latour, for all his importance as a thinker, tends to overlook in his own thinking of art in the Anthropocene, namely the power, the affect of taste. Like many others in the arts and humanities, indeed like so many others, Latour is wedded ultimately to language and to narrative, to telling new stories of the Anthropocene. But that is not really what interests me. If I could just have the second PowerPoint up, that would be great. Thank you. Instead, I want to take a different route into the aesthetic, to think through what Francois Cheng says about Chinese landscape painting in his classic text, Le vide est plein, le langage pictorial chinois, when he states that, and I'll just provide a kind of rough translation. He's basically saying in this translation that in China, of all the arts, painting is the most important. It holds a supreme place. He says it's the object of a kind of a true mysticism because it reveals the mystery of the universe. With respect to poetry, painting, he says, incarnates a kind of vital breath. It creates, not only describes the spectacles of creation, but it allows us to take part in the very gestures of creation. Could I have the third slide now? Thank you very much. Thank you. Cheng's final claim here is important for me, I think, for in it, the eye is not simply an eye that looks and surveys, as has often been the case in Western landscape painting, the slide that I first showed, where land is often speculated on as a prospect, in the double sense of those words, prospect and speculation. Rather, it is an eye that enters into the landscape of mountains and rivers, that in some ways loses its boundaries and finds itself in a different world, a world that is not just fictional or over there, but a world somehow that the spectator carries within and without themselves, a possibility that would rethink taste, not as something to be learned, but as a resonance that evokes a kind of memory, a strange memory, a memory of anamnesis. To think of landscape painting as an entrance into an interior world, into an otherness within the self, is to shift the focus from the eyeball to the lung, as Cheng says, to make optics into a kind of haptics, looking ultimately tantamount to an act of breathing. But why is such a capsizing of the eye necessitated? Simply because to access these landscapes that we already possess somehow, the spectator needs to overcome the difference between object and subject, phenomenon and noumenon, self and other, that conventional models of vision in the West invariably insist upon and thus reproduce. Even in the work of those Western landscape theorists from W.J.T. Mitchell onwards, who have insisted on seeing landscape as a verb, a performance of political power, something that one does, as opposed to something one sees. Landscape, even here, is still approached as a substance that one can mold, shape, and form, a world, an earth that exists beyond the human agent, even if the human in some accounts of landscape today is eventually included within it as an actant in a more than human assemblage. By contrast, what interests me, and this is something that Chinese painting allows for in its creation of black spaces, in its provocation of resonance, is to move away from landscape as something that the human does, and instead to see landscape as something that is done to the human. Landscape here then is agentic. It jumps beyond the pictorial frame. It enters into you. It scapes you. It demands what I've been calling a geometry of morals. Hence then the primacy I place on the eye as a breathing instrument, as a lung, as a thorax, as a mouth. To have a taste for landscape is no longer about being able to discern what is beautiful from what is not, being able to align one's appreciation with a set of predetermined values or criteria. And neither is it to view the world as Pierre Bourdieu claims, from a class-based disposition. A very different habitus of taste is at work in my idea of landscape, a much more radical notion of disinterestedness. For the taste is not to consume an object, both literally and metaphorically, to know what it is to eat well, according to some culinary menu of culture. It is to be able to withstand an intensity, a force that folds itself into you, a power that undoes binary oppositions, not by doing away with them per se, but by making them fluid, porous, permeable, a flowing between that is always a flowing intro. In other words, a geometry again. In the landscapes that interest me, the mouth functions, indeed it embodies the fold. As I conceive it, the mouth is a geometric portal or rim where two properties meet and where interior and exterior are joined in such a way that every inhalation shades into an exhalation and vice versa. In such a landscape, the logic of immunity, the logic that is of capitalist modernity, is no longer tenable. These then are what we could call Anthropocenic rather than anthropocentric landscapes. In them, the eye is blinded and the mouth becomes an instrument of access, an opening that takes in air that is always implicated. To have a taste for landscape, then, is to have nothing other than an appetite for relation, a taste for life, a passion, perhaps, for an earth that is conceived always in movement and as cosmic and inside outside. Could I have the final slide, please? Thank you. Consider this landscape from Ana Mendieta, the Cuban-born American artist, and I think this is important to say, who was probably murdered by her husband, Carl Andre, the sculptor, in Manhattan in the early autumn of 1985. Mendieta's image dates from 1973 and begins her celebrated Silhouette series of performances, photographs, and earthworks that run until the early 1980s. The image here marks the moment when Mendieta visits Mexico and finds herself back in a non-Anglo-European landscape, a landscape that for her resonates with a kind of magic, as she puts it. Mendieta was attracted to Mexico because it existed as a stand-in for Cuba, a landscape from childhood that she was exiled from and prevented from visiting until the 1980s for political reasons. In Mexico, Mendieta was overwhelmed, and while her own discourse, somewhat like that of Antoninatos, is problematic, resonating at times as it does with various forms of primitive essentialism and ecological romanticism, a return to wholeness, a desire for fusion. The images she created seem to offer something different from that, something more ambivalent, something to do with taste, something to do with the geometry of morals I've been talking about. This image, like almost all of Mendieta's silhouettes, is ambivalent. It is impossible to know with any real certainty if what we are witnessing is a funeral or a wedding, if the human is being interred or being born, opened up to earth and sky ritualistically, covered with the most delicate of white flowers that seem, because they levitate above the body, to be both material and immaterial at the same time, caught in a state of becoming that makes language appear all too clumsy, leaden, crude, too late. It is telling, I think, that the body is placed not just between things here, but within them, contained by rock, but exposed also to the sun, covered in the most transient of flowers, blossom. It is as if, and the as if is crucial, that the mouth of the person is breathing the petals out, exhaling breath is vegetal life, becoming a flower being. The ambivalence of the image, the fact that we are unable to ascertain its status, to know what is happening in it, nor what it refers to, is where I think its power resides. The image is compounded, made up of numerous elements that appear to be rising together, folding in and through each other. As in Arthur Rimbaud's poem Marine from the collection Illuminations, terrestrial properties here are shape-shifting, undergoing alchemical mutation. The flowers seem to become oceanic, a spray, like the spume or foam of a wave. There is a sense of relation in this image, yes, but for all its terrestrialism, its groundedness, this relationality seems to be unfixed and unmoored, something that, as dance scholar Erin Manning might say, is in formation, indicative of a mode of individuation that appears to be always escaping us, an interstice between two different states. Will this body deteriorate, or will it regenerate? Is it breathing bloom, or is bloom breathing it? Ultimately, the viewer cannot tell. A moment of performance has been documented in order to perpetuate that moment, and yet we know that the moment has passed. All that remains in the wake of the performance, of the ritual, is an enigma, an image that resonates, an image that arouses some mystery, and thus, I would say again, a passion in the spectator. Through Mendietta's performance, we are left with a taste for the earth, a still image that transmits movement, that transforms the eye of the spectator itself into a mouth that breathes, as we struggle impossibly to fix the image, to make it into a solid object. Mendietta's silhouettes offer something new to landscape aesthetics. The image is neither conventionally beautiful, yet neither is it sublime. Rather, it owes something to a somewhat neglected aspect of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, a mad book from 1790s that, as others before me have pointed out, throws the entire Kantian project up to that point into doubt. After the third critique, Kant's attempt to define the limits of reason, to place the non-human world at a distance, and in itself that shouldn't be discussed, is overthrown internally. Aesthetic taste for Kant, be that beauty or sublimity, is always a question of a feeling, of a power that exists beyond the concept and that no externalized law can account for. In Kant's terms, taste is aphoretic. It is no ground to speak of, being an invention of the individual, and yet demanding a collective response. Taste insists on being shared, on being communicated. Incredibly, taste seems to exist within individuals, but only to the extent that they are universal subjects, obliged to a greater ethical and political community, and I would add in the Anthropocene perhaps, part now of a planetary commons, an earthly multitude. At the very start of the Critique of Judgment, Kant makes the important statement that the aesthetic serves no other purpose than transmitting a power of being alive. Put in terms of this essay, one could say that the aesthetic for Kant is like oxygen. It gives us life. It allows us to breathe. In other words, the aesthetic is contagious, viral, a kind of enthusiasm. I do not use that word enthusiasm lightly. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant says that the idea of the good with affect is called enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, moreover, Kant continues, is a stretching of the powers of the mind through ideas that have no basis in representation and that cannot or will not be satisfied with reason, that is, with scientific proof, with the operations of the cogito, with understanding. Without getting into technicalities, enthusiasm for Kant is a type of non-conceptual experience, an affect that does not, like the sublime, reign in the powers of the imagination, but on the contrary touches something in the subject, creating an intuition that enables it to create new worlds, indeed to wager on life, on collective life, by discovering something universal within its own powers of thinking. This universality, this enthusiasm, this life does not exist as an image or figure that one can read or dissect, and neither is it something that can be narrated, relayed through a story. It is not representable because it is the very source of representation itself, the stuff, the power that creativity runs on and emerges out of. Like Mendietta's silhouettes, enthusiasm is a shadow, a silhouette. Its mode of visibility is fragile, only ever, and just about an outline. I'll just finish with this. How then to access this excess, this intangible force, this intuitive tasting that exists between, within, and beyond written and visual forms? In what ways is one able in the Anthropocene to do as Kant suggests in the essay, an old question raised again, and find something, to quote Kant, in the hearts of all spectators that allows for a wishful participation, a participation that has, he insists, and again this is a direct quote, no other cause than a moral predisposition in the human race. Perhaps one way to get to that taste, as I've tried to do here, is by thinking of landscapes not as images or as forms, but as ways of breathing, immaterial possibilities for being implicated, for being scaped by the enigmatic movement of a cosmic earth in which art becomes neither critique, narration, nor polemic, but rather the catalyst for an enthusiasm that is all the more powerful because we don't know what it is, nor what it can do. Unlike feelings of hope that always look beyond the present to the future, enthusiasm is a moral disposition that realizes that the future is already here, in the present, in our attempts to find new ways of breathing, to transform our eyes into lungs, our retinas into mouths, for the discovery of new tastes on an earth that, as Nigel Clarke and Bron Chevanishky have pointed out in Planetary Social Thought, is incompatible with itself, unrepresentable, agentic, social, and which we no longer seem to have much of a taste for. Thank you.